So I'm going to open by asking the question that I think is probably top of mind for everyone here. I'm not a journalist, but I think it's a rather hard-hitting question. And I think I'm with everyone when I say, I'd like to know, why did you ask to be put in conversation with me?
So, Jamie called up, I guess, and he said, we have this session with Admiral McRaven that's going to be done, and we did that one. Yeah, we're going to do the first night dinner. I said, that'd be great. We did that one yesterday. And then there's another one that'll be this afternoon on global affairs and so forth. Is there any other one you'd like to do? And I said, yeah. I'd love to be interviewed by Julia Whelan. I had described her as the Michael Jordan of narrators. And now I understand she's the Adele of audiobooks. I don't know about you, but I truly believe that one of life's absolute greatest joys is listening to a great podcast or audiobook or audio article while walking the dog. And I travel so much that it's a particular pleasure for me. We have this fabulous Corgi lab that's a lab with short legs, very lovable. She's so happy when I come home. And I just walk her endlessly while listening to, again, various narrated items. And I just adored her voice. I thought that and so I loved Autumn. I was one of your few proud subscribers. You were actually the head of, content or published production for it. I literally would wait for the annual, or the weekly articles that you would read, again, in particular Susan Glasser of The New Yorker, but a number of other authors that you also narrated. And it was just very, very special. I know Susan Glasser well and her husband Peter Baker very, very well. And I literally would email her and said, you got to get Julia reading it again. It's a totally different experience when you do. And actually, I want to start off, in fact, by having the audience hear the audio voice that you have, which is actually very different from your conversational voice.
Yes, if you'd known that, you wouldn't have asked for me. He's like, who is this person?
Yes.
So yes, the general had asked if I could find one of Susan's articles that I'd like to read from, and I did this every Thursday night for 4 or 5 years, and so I kind of just was paralyzed by that task. But what I did is I went back through texts and DMs that I have with Susan, because when something would really jump out at me, there was like a beautiful passage, or she would give me some long Trump quote that I would have to get through, and so I would send these things back and forth, and I found one that this is from the April 23rd, 2020 column. And I found this because I had sent her a video of myself in the booth after I'd recorded it crying. Because I had not totally processed what was happening around. I was just keeping my head down, I was doing my work, and I was not, I had just been oblivious to, as much as you could be, to the virus raging around us. So it was the last 2 paragraphs that stayed with me, but I'm going to ramp up by giving this context. She wrote, on April 8th, a leading model at the University of Washington had revised its projections downward to forecast a total of 60,000 American deaths by the beginning of August. But the nation now looks to hit that number by May 1st, meaning that just a few days from now, more Americans will have died from COVID-19 than the entire toll from the Vietnam War. She ended the piece with this. On Thursday, I left my house for the first time since my once-a-week socially distanced trip to the grocery store a couple days earlier, and drove through the empty streets of Washington, D.C., passing the shuttered headquarters of massive federal agencies and the silent white bulk of Trump's executive mansion. Everywhere I looked, there were flags flying at the top of their flagpoles, and few, if any, people. During my drive home, I turned right on Constitution Avenue, normally crowded with cars headed out to Virginia, and parked for a couple minutes near the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. The national parks are closed too, and no one was there to look at the more than 58,000 names of the American war dead inscribed on Maya Lin's V-shaped black granite monument to them. Will the victims of this deadly spring one day have their names recorded on some grand Washington pile? I doubt it. Trump calls himself a wartime president in his battle against the virus, but like all politicians, he is more eager to speak of victory over the enemy than of the costs of winning. The Vietnam Memorial was not built until 1982, 7 years after the last U.S. troops left Saigon. The dead from this war may have to wait even longer.
Is that not magical?
She's amazing.
And again, the combination actually of Susan's words and her metaphors and her thoughts when read by Julia, I just found very compelling. And so that's why I asked for this, even though that I now discover that your regular voice is different from your magical voice.
And this is why when they were so confused, they were like, why does he want to talk to a romance novelist? And I went, it's my other career. It's my other career that he wants to talk about.
I didn't know she was a romance novelist until I was watching her session yesterday and cringing, actually, because she's written these 2 great books, apparently. One is My
allegedly.
Oxford Year. She spent a year at Oxford, I guess. And then this other one, Thank You for Listening. The Oxford Year one, they had her read the opening, and my God, it's explicit. But there's a catch, because it's actually the person, she's narrating this, the person is actually listening to a podcast or a romance.
Yeah.
Anyway, so, and I'm thinking, God, you know.
I mean, I would suggest, I would argue that
thinking?
the world might be a better place if more 4-star generals read romance, but, you know.
Hold that thought.
And then the one about, then they had her read a piece of the other one, again, Thank You for Listening, which is about these 2 narrators who are having an affair, having never met each other, or something like that. I mean, it's just,
First of all,
and yet it's a virtual, it was just,
both sections were from Thank You for Listening. Thank You for Listening is about yeah, that's okay though. The Thank You for Listening is about two audiobook narrators who fall in love while recording a romance novel, but they don't know who the other person is because they're recording under an alias. The same way that novelists often write under a different name, we will often record more explicit material under a different name. So there's your context.
Reminds me, what was it, You've Got Mail?
That's actually, that was the comp I used when I was pitching it.
There you go.
There you go.
So anyway, so I didn't understand that side of it. And I just wanted to hear the voice. Actually, what I also wanted to do, and there's some others with whom I think you have had a really, again, sort of magical connection. Jane Mayer would probably be another one. Mm-hmm. Who are the others that you would?
Olivia Nuzzi.
Yes,
Rebecca Traister. I mean, a lot of the New Yorker writers. Catherine Flanagan, Atlantic, yeah. I mean,
and this is why I was so devastated, actually, in Autumn. I don't show of hands of how many subscribe to Autumn, please. Your mother, of course, and
obviously.
Your stepmother.
That might have been a comp subscription.
That is so supportive. But the problem was, and I loved Autumn, and again, the dog and I and Autumn were having this incredible experience. And every time, actually, if I would see something that she narrated, I'd just automatically listen. There's one guy like that too.
Eduardo Ballerini.
Eduardo Ballerini is another just spectacular. And it changes the entire experience. And so, in fact, as I said, I'd write to Susan Glasser and say, I can't believe you let somebody else read this thing. It's just not the same. She agreed, but apparently you actually took a week of vacation or something.
I know, I'm so sorry.
I mean,
I'm so sorry.
Where's your dedication?
I was so tied to my booth during the pandemic, and then as soon as I could get away, I got away, and I failed you, and I'm very sorry.
It was deeply disappointing. It was devastating, actually. But I also, the other thing, my other ulterior motive here is that I also wanted to have you read a part of my book, Conflict, which of course is on sale later, and New York Times bestseller.
Get it. It's very good. It's very good.
Please.
I will.
And so I took so I'll set this one up. I took a passage from the chapter on the Iraq War, which I drafted in the first person. Actually, the editor, we submitted it. So I had a co-author, Andrew Roberts, the great Baron Roberts of Belgravia now. His is his 20th book. It's the first one for which he had a co-author. We knew each other really, really well. I've interviewed him on stage numerous times, and he's interviewed me on stage. I even went to his literary festival twice without ever having written a book. And so when we submitted, though, the Iraq and Afghanistan chapters, of course, having commanded both of those, the editor said, this just doesn't work. You just can't sort of say, and then General Petraeus went to see Prime Minister Maliki and explained his concerns about this or that. Actually threatened to quit on him one time. He said, this should be in the first person, just put a little asterisk underneath the title, the chapter title that says, you know, this is written by General Petraeus. Now, Andrew always would edit. I edited this, all that he did as well. But, you know, at the end of the day, the surge in Iraq was the most important endeavor in which I was ever engaged. I happened to command it. It actually happened to work, and it pulled a country out of a Sunni Shia civil war and set them on a good path for 3.5 years until tragically our final combat forces left and they took their eye off the Islamic State. But there were big mistakes made in the beginning in Iraq that were really, really glaring. And remember I was a 2 and a 3 and a 4-star there. I had these 3 different combat commands. And the beginning was the invasion of Iraq. I commanded the Great 101st Airborne Division. We did the fight to Baghdad, took down the regime, took down Saddam. And then the post-conflict phase, it turned out, was more than inadequately prepared for. And then they even fired the initial group. They brought in another individual to head this up. And he made some really catastrophically bad decisions. So please.
Okay. First of all, my question is ORHA an initialism or an acronym?
ORHA is an acronym.
Okay.
ORHA.
Okay.
So by the way, this is how she prepares. She explained all that. By the way, I read these 2 chapters. I thought I'd knock this out in 2 hours.
I was going to ask you about that. Do you want to talk about that first?
Let's
talk about it first. Yeah.
Sure.
How was it recording your own sections in your audiobook?
Much, much more difficult than I thought.
Yeah.
And, you know, and I do a lot of speaking. I've done tons of testimony and everything else. I thought, how hard could it be for me to read my own writing? Turns out very, very hard. We allowed, I think it was 1 4-hour segment on one morning. Thought we'd easily knock these out. Each of these chapters was somewhere around, I think, 35 to 40,000 words. And it turned out it was excruciating. You know, you're in a sound booth. There's an engineer right outside that can communicate with you. There's somebody else online who's stopping you about every other sentence saying, start over at this because you've screwed something up. My voice fails, literally. I have to go out. They said, okay, go gargle with hot salt water. So I find some salt and water and everything else. We go out and gargle. I had to do it multiple times. Again, and I barely knocked out 1 chapter that first day and had to come back in another 4-hour block. So this is not easy work. This is not for the weak or faint-hearted, as they say in the infantry.
Thank you. I mean, I don't want to say it's my own personal war, but...
We're going to create decorations for this. There's going to be a campaign.
I would like a congressional medal or something.
Yeah.
Okay. This is from a section called Losing the Peace. In early May, frustrated by the lack of progress, the Bush administration decided to replace the ineffective ORHA with what would become known as the Coalition Provisional Authority, CPA, led by former U.S. Ambassador L. Paul Jerry Bremer III. Bremer was unquestionably very intelligent. However, he lacked any significant knowledge of Iraq or the wider Middle East and proved to be an unfortunate choice for the job. His first 3 major decisions after arriving in Iraq, taken without consultation with those of us who had been on the ground for 2 months already, all but ensured that a virulent insurgency would erupt in the months ahead. Bremer's first decision was to order an extensive de-Baathification of Iraq's society, which cut too deeply into the Iraqi social fabric. Instead of forcing from public life just the top 2 layers of the ruling Baath Party, around 6,000 members of Saddam's regime and his top lieutenants, the order axed the top 4 layers, removing from their positions 85,000 to 100,000 Iraqis, most of whom had joined the Baath Party as a prerequisite to employment and were advanced largely automatically. These included civil servants, doctors, engineers, university professors, school teachers, and other professionals, the very people that U.S. war plans had assumed would remain in their positions to provide continuity in government and to enable basic service restoration and reconstruction of Iraq. The order denied them government employment, pensions, and in many cases, their government-provided housing and car, as well as meaningful participation in civic life. With exceptions to the order controlled by a de-Baathification commission chaired by the highly sectarian Shia leader Ahmed Chalabi, an expatriate Iraqi who was closely connected to influential members of the Bush administration and who had returned to Iraq in the wake of the invasion, the process was draconian. The CIA station chief told Bremer that if he followed through with the order, by nightfall, you'll have driven 30,000 to 50,000 Baathists underground, and in 6 months, you'll really regret this. His estimate was an undercount by an order of magnitude or more. The second fateful decision was to disband all Iraqi security organizations, including the Iraqi army. Bremer claimed that Bremer claimed that Iraqis despised these instruments of regime control and that he was just acknowledging the obvious, as most soldiers had discarded their uniforms and gone home. However, the hatred leveled at the Republican Guard and regime loyalist organizations was not directed at the sizable Iraqi army, which was seen by many Iraqis as their only true national institution. Indeed, coalition leaders had planned to use that army to help secure the country after the fall of the regime. Though Iraqi soldiers had eventually melted away in combat, many leaders had reemerged after the collapse of the regime, and a very considerable number of soldiers could have been easily recalled with the right initiatives. This would have alleviated the enormous deficit of boots on the ground when the order broke down. Instead, Iraqi officers and soldiers alike were dismissed, deprived of their positions, their pensions, and their place in society. It took 5 increasingly violent weeks of enormous demonstrations before Bremer agreed just to provide stipends and back pay, using money captured during the invasion to the former members of the military. After an exceedingly tense and dangerous demonstration in Mosul the 5th week after the military was fired, in which many thousands of former soldiers with weapons gathered in the square around the governance center, I engaged with the demonstrators using a loudspeaker system and promised to fly immediately to Baghdad and convey their concerns if they dispersed peacefully, which they did. I subsequently flew to Baghdad and located the individual under Ambassador Bremer overseeing security sector reforms. Your policies are killing our soldiers, I told him bluntly. We must pay the former Iraqi soldiers stipends to enable them to take care of their families. Ambassador Bremer approved that recommendation within a week, and it was implemented shortly afterwards, staving off a major crisis. Unfortunately, by the time stipends were announced, enormous damage had been done, and many of the former members of the military had begun to take matters and their weapons into their own hands and entered the ranks of the nascent insurgency. With these 2 decisions, Bremer had gone beyond regime change to destroy the Iraqi state and to create the political and military foundations for the insurgency. Unfortunately, President Bush and the National Security Council had not discussed nor considered the potential effects of these decisions.
It's a tough moment. Again, I was a 2-star. By that time, we'd had to go north to Mosul, a city of about 2 million people in the northern part of the country, the region, Nineveh province, biblical Nineveh, through which almost all of the sectarian, ethnic, tribal, and other fault lines of the Middle East ran. So you literally had an Arab-Kurd fault line, you had Sunni Shia, you had Turkmen, you had different tribes in that area, and the challenges were immense. We actually had it going well. I'd actually run the first election in all of Iraq. We had an interim governor, an interim provincial council. The big idea there had been to develop a council that would be representative of and responsive to all of the elements of society in Nineveh province, with minority rights preserved in addition to having majority rule. And it was going very, very well. I actually did, believe it or not, investment banking deals. We've got investors to come in to buy 2 hotels, invest in them to refurbish them. We had the border reopened. We were training Iraqi security forces already, multi-ethnic, multi-sectarian, and this just cut us off at the knees. And then there was an additional, because you will have heard, 3 decisions that were taken. The other decision was for the Coalition Provisional Authority essentially to oversee Iraq, and to do so with this rotational presidency council, where every month the acting president would rotate, and it would rotate between Sunni, Shia, Turk, Kurd, Arab. It was just nothing short, frankly, of disastrous. we were able to forestall. There was one element of society that was left, and that was the state-owned enterprises, which is basically everything in the country. There's nothing that was private enterprise. We didn't fully understand that, and they certainly didn't. We did up where we were. And so I remember one of my colleagues, my contemporaries, Ray Odierno, who later would be the 3-star under me during the surge and eventually replaced me as well. He had tears in his eyes. This is so profoundly wrong and foolish, because if you'd fired all of the state-owned enterprises, you basically had rendered the entire country unemployed except for a few mom and pop businesses that sold soda out of their garages trying to make a living. So it was a very, very painful moment, and one from which we really did not recover until the surge, when, in a sense, I was Baghdad and could actually mandate reconciliation out in the areas where the government wasn't well represented, such as Anbar province, bloody Anbar, and we were able finally to remedy that stuff. What was interesting is I got exceptions to these up in the north. We got Ambassador Bremer up there one time. I made sure we were in a helicopter, really hot day, scorching hot, with the doors open, which is like being inside a dryer. And he was drowsy, and that happens as well. And he was sort of nodding. I said, Ambassador, could I get a special exception to try out reconciliation up here? We reconciled with tens of thousands, and they all came back. Because at the end of the day, when you're conducting these kinds of operations, you should always have in mind a question that we had actually on the wall facing me. In every one of my combat commands, again, there were 5 as a general officer alone, but the question asked, will this operation or policy take more bad guys off the street than it creates by its conduct or implementation? And these 2 policies created literally hundreds of thousands of Iraqis whose incentive was to oppose the new Iraq rather than to support it. And by the way, you read that beautifully. I hope you also realize, I have a penchant for longish sentences at times. And actually, the one compliment I got on my narration was that I read my longest sentences competently. But you did that beautifully. And again, you see what a difference it makes, actually, to have, again, the Adele of audiobooks read your work.
Okay, I have a question for you.
Okay.
Because one of the things that occurs to me is, I can't imagine if I'm in a position that you're in, where you're trying to create a strategy that will shore up an entire country. Do you ever have time do you find it necessary even to take the time to have a moment that's not that? Like, what are you doing in your off time, if you have it?
Yep, you don't really, in truth. I mean, when you're in combat, especially if you're commanding the whole endeavor, you are the strategic leader. I did have an intellectual construct for what I was doing that I developed between the 3- and 4-star tours when we also did the counterinsurgency field manual, that a strategic leader has to perform 4 tasks competently to have a chance of succeeding. You have to get the big ideas right, craft the right strategy with a really in-depth knowledge of the situation on the ground, the bad guys, the good guys, your allies and partners, the human terrain, the physical terrain, the neighborhood, believe it or not, because suicide bombers are coming in through Syria, et cetera. Understand all that, craft the right strategy. By the way, the big ideas that we developed were 180 degrees different from what we've been doing before. So people talk a lot about change management. You can't change any more than completely reversing what your predecessor's been doing, which caused some degree of, there was not wholehearted embrace of this in the Pentagon. Then you have to communicate the big ideas effectively through the breadth and depth of the organization, most importantly, but to everyone else who has a stake in the outcome of the conflict. You have to oversee the implementation of the big ideas. This is what we normally think of as leadership. It's the energy you provide, the inspiration. It's the example that you set. It's getting great people and developing them and so forth. It's allowing those not measuring up to move on to something else. It's how you spend your time. And we had a huge battle rhythm, that we called it, the schedule, on a big butcher block piece of paper. It laid out what I did every single day of the week. It literally started at 5:30 every morning without fail. Cup of coffee came in the door. There was immediately did some classified email, then would do some other. Then I'd be on a stationary bike. There's already an intelligence book on it. I'd pedal for 30, 45 minutes, do some other exercises, very quick shower and breakfast. And we're in our seats at 7:30 every single morning in this big command center, tiered seating and huge displays in front of you. bit of a Star Wars building for the morning battlefield update and analysis. It was an hour, had all the different elements that we were tracking. This is how you drive a campaign plan, and so forth. And on that battle rhythm, we did actually have running several days a week, in addition to what we were able to do in the morning. But even then, we would bring people in, young officers, because they could keep up with me. And I would literally, I'd say, okay, I want to, I understand this. I mean, an awful lot of the people. We'd all been there now for several tours in many cases. This guy is sharp. I'd like to have him run with me. I think he can keep up. At least I'll let him stay with me for the first 3 or 4 miles. We would run about 6.2, about a 10K. And so even then, you're sort of multitasking. So you're getting a workout, but you're also discussing that individual's perspective on the situation. And just it went on like that.
It's not a lot of romance reading time, I'm going to be honest.
But, and in fact, the book, but
What
I
were
did
you
read.
reading? What were you
I was
reading?
reading Grant Takes Command. In my 3-star job, I'd been in a position where we had a phenomenal historian element. It was part of the Command and General Staff College, which was one of my 6 different hats that I had. We oversaw all of the training centers, service schools, doctrine, leader development, staff college, and a whole host of other things. And I was really fond of the command historian, and he gave me this book, a classic by Bruce Catton, and I thought, oh yeah, I'll have lots of time to do that. A beautiful inscription too, that on the days when the enemy is the worst, and all this stuff, may you find some resonance in this book. And I thought, oh sure, and somehow it got in a rucksack, and I think my enlisted aide took it over, and it got on a little bedside table by my bunk. And I started going through it, and I'd usually get about 3 pages and it would fall out of my hands, but I'd get 3 more pages. And I found it really, really relevant. And I don't want to equate, what I was doing in the surge in Iraq to what Ulysses S. Grant was doing in saving the Union, which is what I believe he truly did do. But the same pressures that he had, the grind of battle, of casualties, of dealing with political figures. I mean, we were getting congressional delegations every day. I remember there was a great cartoon during this time, I think when I was coming back for the first 6-month hearing, which was, going to be tumultuous. And somebody had that famous portrait of George Washington crossing the Delaware River, into that great Christmas Eve strike that they did, the only really decent thing in the first year of the war after Boston. And there's a journalist in the back saying, when are we going to win the war? When are the troops coming home? So you had all this, but it was very, very profound. I believe he's the greatest general in our history, as, again, someone who was successful on the battlefield as a, if you will, a division commander, then an operational commander, 3-star Vicksburg, incredible victory, and then crafts the overall strategy that for the first time lays out what we need to do to win the war. But really the decisive act of the Civil War was not Appomattox. It was the election of November 1864, because Lincoln could have lost that election, and the individual who would have won, who had had Grant's job twice before and failed in it, but nonetheless somehow ends up as the opposition candidate, if he had won, he would have sued for peace, and the Union, as we know it, would not have existed today. Instead, because of the strategy that Grant crafted for the very first time, he got it right, and the victory in Atlanta, and then Savannah and some others, and then the one in the Shenandoah Valley just before the election by the great cavalry general Sheridan, these sealed the victory for Lincoln, something that was very much in question as late as the spring of 1864. And reading all of this was really and very, very instructive, and I took a lot out of it, and I remain grateful to the professor, to the historian who gave me that book. Yeah. It took me months to finish it, but it was my companion every night.
Yeah. Do you also read fiction?
I do. I wasn't reading fiction then.
No, yeah.
No, I was, on a bad night, I'd listen to the soundtrack from We Were Soldiers Once and Young, which was not something I'd confessed at the time. This is a grinding experience.
Yeah.
And war, it's accurate to say that war does change everyone. It really does. It changes you. You become more emotional and so forth. You see it with veterans. I was, in the 82nd Airborne and the 101st Airborne, and they were all approaching the D-Day anniversaries. And in fact, I jumped at the 50th anniversary of D-Day. And I thought, God, these guys, they can cry at the drop of a hat. Well, after my first real serious combat tour, I realized why they could. It does change your emotional being somehow. And occasionally on those really tough days, I'd listen to that, which is probably not the wisest thing to do. But I do actually like fiction, and of all things, I like spy novels. And and some of them are the most implausible.
Right. I mean, you're in a position to know when they're wrong.
Oh, and they're totally fanciful.
Right.
I mean, the idea that the CIA director has at his beck and call this little special off the books kind of arrangement, and he can order them to do whatever he can't do. And
that
yet,
doesn't exist.
And yet, it's like Area 52.
Yeah.
Let me tell you but there's something satisfying about that. Now, there's also something really satisfying when somebody gets it really right. And there's one of my old agency officers who was part of the Syria task force, of all things, David McCluskey, and I wrote a blurb. He sent me the book. He served in one of the civilian sector. And he sent me the book and asked, would I consider doing a blurb? And it was so good, I wrote the best spy novel I have ever read. It was called Damascus Station, and it was seriously realistic. A little bit, again, tiny. You have to be a little bit over the top. And yes, the protagonist did have an affair with his Syrian source, and there was that side of it and all that. But it was phenomenal. And then he followed that up with Moscow X. I'm sure both of these will be great movies as well. And I actually considered writing. We may still do it.
Do you have a novel in you?
Yeah, sure. No, it was going to be called The Eighth Floor, which is the floor in which the director and the senior leadership of the agency sits. And we had a great roughed out theme and all the rest of this. And then, frankly, the other book came along. There was an urgency to get this out because it was sparked by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And Andrew Roberts and I wanted to focus on that. So we'll get back to that at some point. There's also actually another one that I want to do, which comes back to an earlier theme, which will be titled From Battlefield to High Command, because the requirements, the qualities and attributes that make a successful battlefield commander, a Patton or these well-known, again, Ridgway when he was the commander of the 82nd Airborne, are very different from the qualities that you need when you are the strategic leader, because then it becomes all about, can you get the overarching big ideas right? And that's not easy. Do we have any Vietnam veterans in here? If we do, stand up, please. Please stand up. And let me say thank you. We never gave our Vietnam veterans the welcome home that they deserved. In fact, we gave them the opposite of that in many cases. And yet, it was the Vietnam veterans who, more than any other element of U.S. society, ensured that the generation of soldiers I was privileged to lead got the welcome home that they should have gotten. And I've always felt grateful to you for that, in addition for your service in a war against which the public had turned. But the truth is, in Vietnam, we didn't get the big ideas right for 13 years. We were fighting a flawed strategy. The Vietnamese asked us for help with security of the people in the villages, in the hamlets, and we said, no, what you need are big units to fend off an attack such as we just experienced from North Korea to South Korea, and that's what we're going to provide for you. And they were almost irrelevant in the most important task of irregular warfare, which is security of the people. And instead, our focus became thrashing around in the jungle trying to win a war of attrition against an enemy who could replace their losses and was seemingly unfazed by casualties because they saw this as their revolutionary war, their war of independence, and search and destroy operations, indiscriminate use of air power and artillery and mad minutes and all that were creating more bad guys than we took off the field by the conduct of those operations. And only when General Abrams took over, and well after late 1968, did we finally recognize the need to secure the people, do what the Marines had been doing, by the way, successfully in their area, to the scorn of the previous commander. But by then it was just too late. Domestic support had eroded. It was not going to be possible. So again, this getting the big ideas right piece is pretty darn important. We didn't get the inputs right in Afghanistan after a brilliant initial campaign to topple the Taliban and eliminate the al-Qaeda sanctuary in which the 9/11 attacks were planned for 9 years. We got the strategy right with the commander before me, General McChrystal, and then we finally got the additional forces, diplomats, spies, development workers, rule of law experts, financial experts, and all the rest of that, plus the organizational structure that we needed as well, the organizational architecture. And then we only kept it right. In fact, we told the enemy in the speech that announced the buildup, the date that we're going to start drawing down, which seemed ill-advised to me if you're in a contest of wills with an enemy. So this strategic leadership thing is really important, and it's very rare that you find someone who's successful on the battlefield, given the requirements there, which can be personal courage and all this kind of stuff. But here it becomes much more the cerebral component. And if you don't get that right, I don't care how great the individual inspires, looks, energy, all the rest of that, you're working on a flawed, a shaky intellectual foundation.
Can I ask you about that actually? Because
Sure.
the big idea is you've been, I mean, in all the other sessions, people have been asking you about battlefield questions and geopolitical questions, and I think that the one thing that does unite us is the journalism aspect and the need for quality media and informed media. And I really appreciated that you gave time in your book to talk about this plague of misinformation. And I'm going to quote from the book saying, "There is also an information crisis presently haunting..."
Can you do it with your reading voice?
Oh, sorry. Sorry.
Where's your husband? I hope he's not
No,
lining up on me yet.
he's very used to this. Sometimes he'll be like, "Can you do that in your reading voice?" Kidding. There is also an information crisis presently haunting democracies. One MIT study has shown how it takes truth about 6 times as long as falsehood to reach 1,500 people, and that disinformation was 70% more likely to be shared on social media than a piece of news that was true. So what do we do about this?
Well,
is it too late? I mean, what do we...
No, you have to have a comprehensive approach. Life is always a comprehensive approach.
You got 7 minutes to tell us how to fix this problem.
No, I can do that, sure. First, let me just note that I believe that commanders, so there was for a long time a school of thought in the military that, when dealing with the press, you should never pass up the opportunity to keep your mouth shut. And okay, you don't stub your toe doing that.
Right.
But you also are not, I think, doing what you should do, which is to, for example, if you're commanding the surge in Iraq or in Afghanistan, I think America's mothers and fathers have a right to know something about the individuals who's leading their sons and daughters, trying to perform the task of a strategic leader right, and what it is we're trying to do with their sons and daughters. And of course, others have that similar right. I think it's very important. And I actually made myself very accessible to the press, sometimes to a fault, frankly. I had a whole briefing that said, on dealing with the press, and the first one was all these happy things, great cover stories and this kind of thing, and it's just titled, "You can't win if you don't play." And then the next slide was all the ones where I really screwed up, and it said, "You can't lose if you don't play." Including one, by the way, where I was a 2-star. We had this incredible day, and I have a Washington Post reporter with me. We decided on our own to reopen an international border. We sent the UN Security Council regulations and restrictions on trade with Iraq out to the brigade commander, told him, develop some promulgating instructions. The governor and I are coming out in 3 days, and we want the border reopened, because we had to get more goods and service and so forth into the marketplace, because we were about to pay all the workers, and it would have driven prices up if you didn't do that. I used to teach econ. And so anyway, we're out there. It was unbelievable. We just restored life to the entire western part of Nainoa province. It was like, the hand of God. It was like switching the flip on an irrigation system, which I did about a month later, by the way, after repairing it. And so, And then we had this huge goat grab, as we call it, this celebratory chow food, and hundreds of sheikhs there, all so grateful that their tribal members are actually employed again. And there was a 2-mile line of trucks lined up already. We'd sent word over to Damascus that we were going to reopen this. I didn't tell the Secretary of State, and General Powell took some issue with that, saying, now you have your own independent foreign policy. I said, hey, I told my boss, I can't, But anyway, so we're in all these helicopters, and I made sure I had a lot of attack helicopters with me to show who the sheikh of the strongest tribe in Iraq was at the time. And they're wheeling around, and we're taking off, and the dust is going and everything else. And this Washington Post reporter on the headset says, my God, General, that was really extraordinary. What did it feel like? And I said, it was really. Just as the best day I've had in Iraq since maybe the liberation. And what did it feel like? It felt like a cross between being the Pope and the President. The next day, in the Washington Post, above the fold, General David Petraeus, a cross between Pope and President. So anyway, so you can't lose if you don't play. And I had a bunch of others, by the way, too. Can this man save Iraq as a 3-star? That didn't go down well with a 4-star. But then I said, but you got to play. Again, America's mothers and fathers have a right, others have a right, you have to do it. And so I always said, and I had embedded reporters, and yes, I forgot I was on the record when halfway to Baghdad I started asking repeatedly, tell me how this ends, because it was clear that the assumptions were being invalidated one by one. But then I developed a big idea for dealing with the press during the surge. It was be first with the truth. We want to beat the bad guys to the headline, because they're trying to get there too and accuse us of some atrocity or something. So we want to get the headline, but we're only going to do it with the truth. If it's a bad day, we're going to say it's a bad day. We're not going to put lipstick on pigs, as they say. And so that was our approach. That's what has to be done here, but you have to do it in a really comprehensive way. We actually hired a political campaign organization from the United Kingdom. It worked for one of my staff officers, and it was watching every TV channel, print media, publication, and the internet such as it was at that time, and responding immediately, which is what you do in a political campaign war room. That's sort of what you have to do. The problem is that the individuals communicating in many cases, the same with, candidly, in a political campaign year, we don't always have the best messengers for this, or the most effective, or the ones with the greatest credibility. And then sometimes the message itself isn't as impressive as perhaps they think it is. So you've got to get the big ideas right.
Make up whatever they want. I mean,
It has to be challenged as quickly as we can. But I note that, yes, look, the landscape, and I'm non-political. I don't even register to vote. I stopped when I was a 2-star. So there's no political bias here. But we have news channels that are very clearly aligned with one party, or in some cases one candidate or the other. And then there are social media sites that proliferate that just feed grievance and so forth. And somehow we have got to much more relentlessly communicate what the facts are as we understand them, and you just do it again relentlessly. And that's what we sought to do. But I acknowledge that the landscape is more challenging.
Yeah, I mean,
this is the biggest, I think, the biggest challenge to democracy.
Especially when you get to the point where when people can't believe their eyes and they can't believe their ears, and everything can be manufactured. I just, this was my part of going to work for Autumn, was at least supporting journalists and trying to make journalism more accessible to people. But I don't know that it's, I don't know who's got their eye on this ball. Like, I feel like the big idea, there needs to be a group of people coming together, figuring out what this looks like, what the big idea is for how to tackle this.
I think it's a fair comment. There are groups out there that have tried to address this, but so far none of them has had the sort of the heft and the reach and the resources and all the rest of that. But perhaps this could be your new endeavor now that Autumn got bought by New York Times.
No, I've got Audiobook that I'm trying to get off the ground, and we'll see. I mean, it's the same thing. It's a quest for some kind of authoritative knowledge and, some basis of truth, and trying to counteract this onslaught of AI and digital manipulation. But I just don't, I worry that that's all of the other geopolitical battlefields we have going on, this is the common thing among all of them.
I think this, again, it's a fair comment. There are countries around the world that deal with this pretty effectively, and I travel the world just sort of nonstop. Some are able to do it because their culture is just slightly different. Others are able to do it because the government is willing to intervene and take action against those. Some of these are sort of the slightly more autocratic democracies and so forth, which, again, if they're doing that right, I think I commend. I've seen some really benevolent, not dictators, but benevolent senior leaders. I mean, Lee Kuan Yew was, I think, incredibly admirable, despite essentially a system. But there, the determining issue is, did they get more than 70% in the election or not? One year they did not, by the way. When I was CI director, I remember going out there and we thought the cracks are finally showing. They actually did soul searching. They came back together, and they've done very, very well. In fact, I just met with the Prime Minister when I was out there in December. So I think you're exactly right. I think that as a challenge to democracy, this is probably the single biggest one that exists. And how you grapple with that, and especially in a democracy that prides itself on allowing not quite anything goes, is the issue.
Okay,
On that happy note.
Yes, thank you so much
Thank you for taking
this.
a chance on us.
Thank you.